I'm Paul Solomon. I'm part of the College of Fine Arts at WMU. When I arrived here, I was asked to be part of the Photographic School of Art, which makes sense in that I have a deep, long-standing involvement with visual art, especially photography. However, I think of myself as much. I think of myself just as much as someone who's anchored in a number of different areas that overlap. I'm primarily interested in ideas and concepts, and there are times where I flesh those out through writing, sometimes through different forms of visual art, and even in other ways. When I did my graduate work at Ohio State University, it was a radically interdisciplinary degree. The chair of my thesis committee was director of the School of Dance there, and I was working with a professor who was specialized in studies about Joseph Beuys and performance art in the Department of English there. It's always challenging for me to organize myself in terms of a curriculum vitae in print, and certainly to do it verbally, because what I'm most passionate about are the ways in which ideas, people, events are linked in ways that don't owe any obedience to categories or academic silos. And this is reflected in how I teach, it's reflected in what I teach, and it's very much reflected in my creative process as an artist. When I think of my current life that has a lot to do with being in an academic institution, I think back to the world that I was engaged in as a child. I grew up in a home and in a community which put a tremendous value on learning for the sake of learning. And I grew up in a household where both my parents were teachers. I think in many ways I owe a lot about who I am to each of my parents. So I grew up right outside New York in northern New Jersey. And I was definitely a geeky little boy, and I would spend my time doing little experiments outdoors or in my little chemistry lab. I was fascinated by how sunlight seemed to change different substances, and began to do experiments with that. We lived just a few miles down the road from where Thomas Edison had his huge laboratories in West Orange, New Jersey, and often got to visit there. And at that time, there were still some older men who had known Edison, so it was really an enchanting experience, and inspired me for a long time to come. I think at some point I knew I had a calling to teach. However, there were other things I had much more interest in doing when I was in my teens and 20s. I went to undergraduate school at one of the best art schools in the country, Rhode Island School of Design. When I left RISD, I came to New York and opened a shop up right away, so to speak, as a photographer. But I had a lot to learn, and I was quite stubborn and didn't want to have to learn or apprentice from anyone else. But gradually I made lots and lots of mistakes and figured out how to do some things right. And so for those years in New York City, photography was my means of making income in a creative way. I would do all I could on assignment, doing commissions, and then use time and capital that I would try and amass to do my more, in some ways, personal artwork that involved a lot of collaborative activity with choreographers, dancers, people in theater, and for example, the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. I co-produced a big installation piece with them. When I spoke on February 5th, I believe I began by talking about my long-standing kind of beguilement, interest in ways that technology, particularly photographic technology, can be used in ways that surprise one. So that, for instance, based on this long-standing, since childhood, interest in how substances are changed by light, I did these experimental images in which I relied upon the photosensitive nature of human skin to make images on people's bodies using simply ultraviolet light. Since the dawn of the digital age, back in the late 1980s, at least in terms of photography, I was fascinated with and I became immediately familiar with Photoshop. I also began to experiment, or somewhat later began to make some experiments in which I used traditional media, analog photography and things such as creating a physical montage of images on a substrate in ways that mimicked what one might expect from image processing software, but I was doing it the old school way. So I've always been interested in subverting expectations about technology. Well, I still love working with all kinds of media. When I'm really free, whenever that happens, traveling, for example, then I'm most inclined to draw or sketch in a journal. But photography holds a special place for me because it allowed me, especially beginning working with photographic technology as a kid, to be equally involved in science and aesthetics. So photography, certainly in those days, involved using optics and chemistry, as well as being able to exercise one's eye as an artist. So in that way, photography was, and in certain ways still remains, a synthesis of what we think of as science and art. An artist, by definition, I'd say, is someone who lives in the present moment, argues with the past, and imagines the future. And that's why we value, and that's why we need the artist, because the artist, the good artist, is immersed in the present moment, knows what's come before, and is argued with those artists and those thinkers of the past, but also has his or her ear to the ground and senses before most other people what is coming down the rails. So that, for example, if you look in the 1960s, we had Federico Fellini in film and Andy Warhol in everything, who already had a clear sense that our society was coming to be dominated by a cult of celebrity and this massive capitalist-driven consumer, voracious appetite for consumer objects, and they put it out there right in front of us in films like La Dolce Vita and in all of Andy Warhol's production of film, paintings, and prints in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I came to Western to direct an unusual program. It was unusual then, and it's still unusual, called Direct Encounter with the Arts. And as I've come to structure it, I think of it as a course that's about culture, but culture understood by entering through various portals in the arts. So by involving students with guest artists that I bring here, in taking them to dance concert, theatrical productions, to see exhibitions, look at architecture in the streets here. In this way, students come to, or my goal is for them to learn how to have an opinion about things, how to articulate that opinion, how to be inspired in that process by artists and others. Students in these courses need to know more about the past, the cultures of the past, ones we come from, ones we're influenced by, and know more about our culture, which in turn now has influenced so much of the world. Art's an entirely subjective experience for the artist and for the viewer. We live in a time where there's this paradox. We have unparalleled different avenues for gaining information and for disseminating our own viewpoints, or how we look at the world, what we think about it. At the same time, at least I sense often with my undergraduate students that it's become ever more challenging for them to know and hone their own opinion. So learning how to approach a work of art, learning how to observe it and comment on it without criticism, no holds barred, is the beginning of a path towards knowing themselves and knowing the world.